Hello there, my friends. Salamun alaikum. I hope you are doing well. It is great being with you again for another discussion. And today I want to deal with the topic of explaining, understanding, reading the Qur'an, and explaining away the Qur'an. Now, I want to in particular look at a few verses, and then I want to also give you just some history. And the particular aspect of history I want to show you is the history of what we call the Batini trend within Islam. Now, there is a historical trend called the Batini trend, and let me just quickly summarize for you because I have in www.britannica here that gives a very neat and succinct explanation of what the Batinia really is. And let me just go through that with you just very, very quick. Batinia Muslim sects, the Ismailis in particular, that interpreted religious texts exclusively on the basis of the hidden or inner meanings. The Arabic batin means the hidden, the inner, the implicit, not the implicit, but rather the mysterious meaning, rather than the literal meanings. This type of interpretation gained currency about the 8th century amongst certain esoteric Shiite sects, especially the Ismailis, a religiously and political schismatic group. The Ismailis believed that beneath every obvious or literal meaning of a sacred text lay a secret hidden meaning which could be arrived at through ta'wil. Ta'wil means allegorical interpretations. Thus, every statement, person, or object could be scrutinized in this manner to reveal its true intent. They further state that Muhammad ﷺ was only the transmitter of the literal word of God, but it was the Imam empowered to interpret through ta'wil, that means through interpretive reading and through finding allegorical meaning, to find the true meaning. But just to skip a bit, Sunni, but we have to mention that Sunni traditionalist Muslim scholars condemned the Batinia for all interpretations that rejected the literal meaning. Through a multiplicity of this, the Sunnis alleged allowed ignorant or mischievous persons to claim possession of religious truths and thus deceive those who lacked the knowledge to expose them. The Batinia were further labeled by the Sunnis as enemies of Islam, bent on destroying the Sunnis' conception of faith. I think there's something else I wanted to read also, and that is the Sufia, this part here. Speculative philosophy and theology eventually influenced the Batinia though they remained at all times on the side of esoteric knowledge. Some Sufis, Muslim mystics, were also placed among the Batinia for the insistence that there was an esoteric body of doctrine only known to the initiate, that is the dervish, the initiate to a Sufi order. So in summary, how I can summarize that is that this approach to reading the Qur'an not as a literal text, but as a text that masks or that conceals a secret underlying hidden meaning, allegorical, symbolic symbolism. That is not something new that dates back to certain sects in the 8th century, and also certain Sufis also have accepted the principle that the Qur'an is not an obvious literal text. Now, I just want to mention that the Qur'an obviously has meanings that are not literal. The verse where Allah, where God says in the Qur'an, there are verses that are Muhkamaat and Mutashaabihaat. Now, the word Mutashaabihaat, Shabih means to resemble, or it's related to what allegory or metaphor. So yes, clearly the Qur'an states that this book contains metaphor as well as literal passages. Right, Muhkamaat and Mutashaabihaat. Now the question is, how far do you take the idea of the Mutashaabihaat? And who decides what is a Mutashaabihaat, what is a literal passage, and what is a metaphorical passage? Because there's obviously the risk of overemphasizing the metaphorical aspect of the verse and then falling in the trap of losing the obvious or the clear or the apparent meaning of the verse. And that is the issue I want to raise with you today. And as I've shown you, there is a long history with this type of reading of the Quran going back to the 8th century. And so what do we do with this? Because clearly in our world today, we find that it poses a challenge to the ordinary reader of the Quran. Now, we know that the Quran often mentions that it is a book in clear Arabic. The Quran calls itself a bayina. It is a clear and self-evident text. So if it is self-evident and if it is clear, then how do we deal with this idea of Mutashaabihaat? Because there are now commonly people who will read passages and infer a completely non-literal or allegorical or metaphorical meaning from the verse, whereas the next person might say, no, but this is clearly literal. There's no way that this could be metaphorical. And so I've heard many people, people who are in the Quran alone group, movement, whatever, Quranism or Quranist or Quranite movement, they actually move towards, sort of slowly drift towards more of a metaphorical reading of many of the passages. And we need to make sense of it, because at the end of the day, the risk we face is that, doing metaphor is very subjective often. And so if you give two people the same verse and they get to different meanings, then the Quran is no longer a binding instrument. It no longer serves as what it calls itself, the rope, habl, that we should all seek to find unity and cohesion in. So then the Quran, instead of becoming a cohesive work, becomes a sort of a divisive or divisive work. Now, I want to share with you something about research, because I think it's relevant here. You see, now, research is something that the knowledge of how to do research and how to do textual and discursive analysis is relevant here. Because obviously, we as Muslims, we often think that we are the first people to do this challenge. It's the first time that this challenge is being met. But I can tell you now that, the current dominant civilization, Western civilization, we have a lot to learn from them, because they've already been through this. And we standing there being arrogant, saying, but the Muslims, Islam has all the solutions. We don't need to look at them. Meanwhile, we're the biggest hypocrites, because we like our Mercedes, we love our computers, we like our gadgets, which is developed within this world. And so we have this sort of duality, this cognitive dissonance, this messed up brain where we love the West, but we hate the West. So we don't know how to make sense of it. But I'm here to tell you that the West, in any group, any person, whether he's Western, Eastern, African, European, can teach me something. Because you know what? If you look at the Quran, how many times does Allah not cite the arguments of the devil? You see, so then the Quran will say, and so he said, quoting the devil. So for me, it's nonsense. The idea of censorship doesn't even come up. We don't censor anyone. We don't embargo anyone's speech, because if the devil is not censored in the Quran, then the only thing we censor, and which I prefer, which I think we shouldn't, is violence, verbal violence, oral violence, or that type of thing, a complete toxicity, rudeness, unacceptable language, and that type of thing. We keep it dignified and respectful, and that's why. Right, I'm drifting from the point here. So let me come back to the point. We have the risk of looking at metaphorical meaning and losing what should be perhaps literal meaning, or vice versa. And yes, there were historical groups called the Zahiriya, and they were the opposite of the Batiniya. Now, there's an Islamic approach, which is the Hanbali sect, which is the Saudis or the Wahhabis. They're the Zahiris. They go the complete opposite direction. Instead of making passages metaphorical, they make every passage literal. And so when the Quran speaks about the hand of God, they literally see it as God having a hand. So you have the two extremes. You have the Batiniya and the Zahiriya, but I'm discussing the Batiniya because the risks associated with being a Batini or just putting everything down as metaphorical is also a risk. But I think education research, as it is taught in the West, gives us the answer. And that is where I want to go next. So I want to show you an excerpt from this book, Research Methods in Education. This is the standard text that is used at Western universities. It's the textbook that I used also at one stage. And it is the textbook of how to work through analysis, research, data. And you must remember, the idea with research and understanding is that you always sit with a body of data in front of you, right? So you always the researcher is always looking at something that is in front of his eyes, clear, like it could be the words of the Qur'an, it could be the behavior of people which he's observing, it could be a natural phenomenon like the sun rises. The researcher is dealing with empirical evidence or literary evidence, in this case, the Qur'an. And the researcher's job is to make sense of the data in front of his or her eyes. Now let's look at the Qur'an. The Qur'an, just as much as any other phenomenon of nature, we need to have certain rules when we look at the Qur'an. Now, coming to this work here, we see here on page 167, that's at least the PDF page, we see reliability in qualitative research. Now, we can learn something here. While we discuss reliability, the suitability of the term is contested. Right, let's just quickly get past that. Terminology. So reliability is connected to terms such as credibility, neutrality, confirmability, dependability, consistency, applicability, transworthiness, and transferability. In particular, the notion of dependability. So let's stand still here, because that is really what we are looking at. We are looking at a reading of the verse of the Qur'an, which, if you claim it to be metaphorical, then you need to demonstrate credibility, neutrality, confirmability. dependability, consistency. And why I highlighted confirmability. Why did I highlight the word confirmability? Confirmability is the idea that somebody else sitting with the same text independently. So another researcher of equal ability reading that same text independently of you. Confirmability means that such a reader, an investigator, such a researcher will of necessity come to the same conclusion. And that is really an important point of reliability in research. And there's a few more points that is mentioned here that I just want to show you. And that is really the golden standard of Western research, is the peer review system, or the system of triangulation. So triangulation, and here we have a nice summary here: stability of observations, whether the researcher would have made the same observations and interpretation of these if they had been observed at a different time or in a different place. So in other words, if somebody read that verse in a different age, in a different era, it would lead to the same meaning. Okay? You get that? Let me show you the screen. I'm not showing the screen right now. So the important point here is stability of observations, whether the researcher would have made the same observation if they had been observed at a different time. Parallel forms, whether the researcher could have made the same observations and interpretations of what had been seen if he had paid attention to other phenomena. So it would be incidentally also true if it didn't come at that. And then most importantly, I think, inter-rater reliability, whether another observer with the same theoretical framework and observing the same phenomena would have interpreted them in the same way. Now, what you must remember here, we are not saying here that the teacher gets confirmation from his class, from his students. That's the idea of the word peer. You see, the word peer review means not student review. A student cannot vet and evaluate the teacher. So if I make this video here, and I have a few loyal viewers on YouTube, confirmability is not that they confirm my findings, because they are not my peers. They don't, as a rule, and I'm saying this, as an example, in a particular subject where, let's say, I'm a statistics expert, and they are not mathematical statistics experts, they would not be able to vet my work. If I'm a mathematician, and I construct a proof or a mathematical argument, and they don't understand the logic or the components of the theory behind those arguments, they would be unable to vet or to assess or to evaluate whether my reasoning has been effective. And that is why it comes down to a peer review, inter-rater reliability, whether another observer with the same theoretical framework and observing the same phenomena would have interpreted in the same way. Do you see what I'm coming at? The West has already found a solution to this idea of rampant metaphorical interpretation of a text. And the answer is that it should be time-proof, it should be space-proof, and it should be person-independent. As just a quick summary. Now I want to take you to the Qur'an, and I want to show you how the Qur'an has covered this issue. You see, the Qur'an here is just one example, chapter 25, verse 35. It says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولقد آتينا موسى الكتاب وجعلنا معه أخاه هارون وزيرا. Absolutely crucial. Long ago we presented Moses with a code and appointed his brother Aaron as his adjutant. And an adjutant, a wazir, is a co-minister manager, is a partner, is a peer. It's somebody who helps you think through the matter. And so importantly, when Allah, God, revealed this absolutely amazing divine code to Moses, He allowed for the system of peer review. He allowed for the system of an independent person, because remember, Aaron was the older brother, I believe, of Moses. And so Aaron, whether he was the older or younger brother, I'm not sure now, but it doesn't matter. They were peers. They approached Pharaoh together, and Pharaoh treated them equally. He was not an assistant or some junior aide to Moses. In fact, when Moses left to receive the divine instructions, Aaron was in charge. He was a full, leader or guardian of the people. Now, if it was just Aaron and Moses that showed this type of peer review system, then it would be a chance. It would be maybe just a coincidence in the Qur'an. But we find also another of the great messengers, the Spirit of God, Jesus, Isa, how he also received confirmation, approval, and vindication by a peer, which was Yahya, John the Baptist. So once again, two messengers simultaneously appear. In fact, if you look at Surah Yasin, أرسلناهم اثنين فعززناه بثالث, where Surah Yasin, I think the 36th chapter, I'm not sure, of the Qur'an, describes a situation where two messengers appear to a town. So Surah Yasin, it sketches this, it sort of like frames the way that the message is delivered in terms of two messengers. So two messengers arrive, strengthened by a third one. In chapter 25, the Quran speaks about Nuh. You might think Nuh came alone, but then, strangely enough, the Quran actually mentions many messengers at the time of Nuh. Take a look at this, chapter 25, verse 37. I always thought Nuh was alone. Nuh escapes this rule. Nuh doesn't fall within this rule of peer review messengers. But yet, here it says, وَقَوْمِ نُوحَ لَمَّا كَذَّبُوا الرُّسُلِ. You see, as for Noah's people, when they repudiated the messengers, لَمَّا كَذَّبُوا الرُّسُلِ. So they were clearly, at the time of Noah was the founder of a series of messengers. And I've made a video about this. Noah did not live for 950 years. Noah's house, the ideas of Noah, Noah's message, the messengers lived for 950 years. Their surname was Noah. In other words, their surname was Noah. But they were a group of messengers, as this verse clearly says. How else are you going to explain chapter 25, verse 37? وَقَوْمَ نُوحٍ لَمَّا كَذَّبُوا الرُّسُلِ. As for Noah, when they repudiated the messengers. So in other words, messengers never ever made their findings, made their code, made their argument known to the people without having triangulation, without having confirmability. And I come back to the research here where the messengers always required inter-rater reliability, with another observer with the same theoretical framework and observing the same phenomena could interpret it in the same way. Now, yes, I'm not saying it's impossible for somebody to make a rare reading of a particular verse and to find it to be metaphorical. But it is important that such reading be confirmed by peers, by independent peers. And that this should be, of course, there's no question that the reading should be logical, consistent, fall within the general logic of the Qur'an. But this peer confirmation is an extremely important part. And we know that Western education is based, higher education, postgraduate education, doctoral, masters, etc. education is based on the peer review system. You know, the Salafis, or those people who want to keep us stupid, they always argue that if you allow for free thinking and if you allow for people to apply their rational minds, that it will be all and sundry. And I think they have a point when the Batini readings of the Quran goes rampant. And I sometimes think these Batini fringe readings, you know, the very strange readings of certain verses, plays in the hands, these readings play in the hand of these Salafis, because they show the ordinary Muslims that, look, if people are going to think freely, they will just create, you know, balderdash. They will make up meanings. They will explain away all the meanings in the Quran, and then they go and defend their literal Wahhabi Salafi reading again. So the pendulum, you see, the pendulum, we shouldn't be on the extreme literal side, and we shouldn't be on the extreme metaphorical or batiniya side, allegorical or hidden meaning side. What we should be doing is we should be using scholarship in terms of peer review. We should use consistency, as it says here in this textbook. The observations should be stable, and just because, you know, people are now having a war in the Middle East, we shouldn't find every verse to relate to that. You see, so it should be time proof, it should be space proof, it should be temporally and spatially relevant, our readings, and most importantly, it should have confirmation from independent observers. Now, just in closing, you see, one of the very encouraging and self-reassuring experiences that I've had when I started reading the Qur'an independently away from the hadith literature. And I'm not saying I say these literatures of no use. No, I just take the divine power out of them. They don't have divine power or divine sanctioning. They're just literature. But when I decided to read the Qur'an just as the Qur'an, I was worried that, am I seeing it the right way? Like, for example, the word salah. Right? I was worried I'm maybe seeing it. I clearly saw it because I read the word salah, studied the word throughout the Qur'an, and I made the finding that this could not mean prayer. It's not prayer. It doesn't mean prayer in ancient Arabic, and it doesn't look like prayer in the Qur'an, because the way the word is used, often it is applied in a way that it couldn't be prayer. But I made my finding, and then what was very encouraging and what was reassuring to me was when I found Arab researchers, Algerian, American, Western, British, African, Asian, when I found readers and students of the Qur'an making that same finding, that the salah has been mistranslated, misexplained by the traditional hadithist scholars. And that salah is something much more than what they've made it out to be. And by fitting it into the historical analysis of kings and emperors and sultans, dictating to scholars what they should say, it made sense to me. And there is that triangulation, there is that peer review, there is all of that coming together and confirming that word salah. So what I'm saying to you is that I'm very, very aware of the problem of becoming an independent fringe reader, having a fringe reading of the Qur'an. And as I've mentioned to you, the solutions are already there. Western scholarship can teach us a thing or two. as long as we are not arrogant and we don't think that we have nothing to learn from anyone else except our priests. They can tell us about, quantum physics. The Sheikh on the Mimbar can cancel quantum physics, and he can cancel, cosmology, modern cosmology. And that Sheikh, he's got all the answers, and all those Sheikhs who lived 1,000 years. As long as we just rid ourselves of that nonsense, we will be able to tread a very, very reliable path of understanding the Qur'an. I hope that's useful to you, my friends. Assalamu alaikum.